I want to cut to the heart of this entire pattern, which is the unlovability, or more accurately, the inability to love the most vulnerable, authentic self in the face of the inner child. We have an abuse cult that marginalizes, forgets, passes on messages of worthlessness and violation, traumatizes, beats, humiliates, and abandons the most vulnerable, sensitive, and feminine portions of the psyche in our infants and in our children, whether it's abandoning them to television and screens, or abandoning them to the feeling that they're not worth seeing and knowing as we rush off to hectic lives. We pass on the message of worthlessness, and it's not enough for many anxious and shame-based parents to pass on this message, because at some level we know as parents, we know as members of this culture, that what we're doing to our children is wrong. That it's not an intelligent allocation of resources, and that the depression, the mental emotional disease, the obesity, the addiction, and the isolation, as well as the masks of our children, are reflections of the crimes of the culture to fail to attune to the most vulnerable, emotional, physiological needs of our children, for presence, for attunement, for validation of their being independent of outer performance, and for a message of genuine value by spending quality time, as opposed to passing off trinkets and media stimulation as a substitute for presence and parenting. We understand this, and it leads and leaves a deep void and a deep wound that many seek to medicate, not only with outer drugs, but with busyness, with shopping, and with new relationship energy, sex, distraction, the whole chemical rush that comes with that, in a frantic attempt to avoid that pain. When no grown-up has been willing to face that terrain in the unloved child, when grown-ups have lied, run, avoided, deflected, humiliated, and obfuscated the terrain of emotional abandonment in the wounded child, the message that the child accurately picks up is that the parent, the teachers, the older siblings, the grown-ups around will do anything short of outright murder, and that's not always out of the question, to avoid dealing with this inner terrain, because that's what they do. For some reason, they can binge watch Netflix for 8 hours, but when it comes to face this feeling for 10 seconds, suddenly they've got to get something else done. They can show up to criticize and shame and humiliate these feelings for 45 minutes, but if asked for present attention for 5 minutes, they will give a 45-minute lecture on why they don't have time for 5 minutes of presence. This insanity communicates the terror of the cult, the terror and the incompetency of the grown-ups and the parents around to encounter this most vulnerable, lonely, and helpless terrain of abandoned and regressed trauma that has been transformed into the shame carried by the child. This is such a deep wound, it rarely gets dealt with in therapy. The therapist doesn't necessarily want to go into this terrain or know how to do it. The client, having been shamed for being out of control, having been shamed for sensitivity, having been shamed for emotionality, having been shamed for feeling small and helpless in a chauvinistic cult, doesn't want to go into those feelings either, particularly within the cruelty of a 50-minute container that does not respond to the vulnerability of the terrain, but responds to the schedule of the professional who shows up on condition of payment for a set time at a set location and asks their patient to fit within that container. Hey, if you can have an emotional breakthrough of entering your deepest shame and trauma and come out one way or another in 50 minutes, go at it. If you're not sure, don't go into the terrain, because that's what you're going to get from me. It's not uncommon. In fact, one survey showed that 1/3 of therapeutic patients feel worse after a year of therapy. 1/3 feel better, 1/3 feel no change at all. It's not uncommon for years of therapy to go by without touching on this arena. Now, I did inner child work at age 14, 15, 16, and 17. I did the meditations while the abuse was going on in my household, while my parents' marriage was falling apart, while the trauma was occurring. I did inner child work and achieved a 30% shift, meaning I felt it. There was a 30% shift. And after a few hundred hours of reprogramming, etc., I didn't really know what else to do. I went on to work with 30 or 40 therapeutic practitioners in one form or another, spent well over $150,000 in direct expenses and tens of thousands of dollars more in time off work and various life costs to try and respond to these helpless, terrified feelings that are so overwhelming that some part of me would rather die than go into that terrain alone. Now, psychedelics are a neutral factor. They break down barriers. They break down defenses. In this case, the defense against that painful wound was broken down through a high dose of MDMA and psilocybin pushed by Peter Sandhill. The loneliness and desperation for love in that void, which it exposed me to, was immense and beyond my conscious ability to respond to. More disturbingly, it was beyond my therapist, my facilitator, my lover, responsibility to or willingness to respond to. The level of violation and dishonor, going from glossing over that pain, not responding to requests, not providing the container necessary to hold that space. The level of shame and distance that came my way as I expressed anger at the betrayal of first being seduced into an overdose and then being thrust into the very thing I've fought my whole life not to do, to be forced to face this traumatic loneliness alone, with the clear message that no one loves me and that everyone is so afraid of this terrain that they'd rather have me go into it alone than join me and offer support. It's painful enough to go into these rooms, these dark nightmares of the psyche, with a competent, loving person there. To be thrust in there, to protect everyone else from having anything to do with it, with the message, I will do anything to avoid going into this terrain. I will lie to you. I won't show up. I won't hold container. I won't acknowledge it. I don't want to go there. Is beyond most of our abilities to do. And this is a shame protocol, to put someone into the deep waters they can't deal with alone. Trauma is one of the few areas in psychology where help is absolutely necessary. Competent help is absolutely necessary. To induce that terrain, to shatter the protections that obscure that amount of hurt, that amount of loneliness, that amount of pain, without support, is as cruel as slicing open someone's skin and refusing to provide anesthetic or report or support to stitch up the wound. That has been done to me by Peter Sandhill. And when presenting that crisis and that wound to the entire facilitator body, I asked for one thing: to be held and to be listened to. Now, this is on top of hundreds upon hundreds of requests. I remember when I was in the dissociated psychedelic state, I couldn't see clearly, I couldn't think clearly. All I could get out of my mouth in a mantra, hundreds of times: your love is the most important thing. 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 It is impossible to be more explicit about the sensitivity and crisis of trauma and the wound. Than to state over and over again that the love of the healer is the most important thing. Why? Because when that child has been hated, feared, shamed, and buried under the threat of death, there is no template within the self to love the part of you that nearly got you killed because you were raised by sociopaths. There is no part that has the training to embrace the part that gets blamed for nearly ending your life, for being hated. So that love has to come from the outside. In a shame and fear-based cult, when this wound inside each one of us, you see, part of what a shame-based chauvinistic culture does when a sensitive talks about the pattern is pass the buck. You're not sensitive? It's easier to numb. It's easier not to know this terrain. It's easier to cover it up with drinks and parties and extroversion, etc., and busyness. But this wound is in the cult, deeply embedded. For one person, it might be 5% of their psyche goes through this terrain. For another person, it's 30%. For another person, it's 10%. That's 10% of the self in trauma, in regression, in suppression, buried with a cohesive message that if it reveals itself, however long it stays buried. Imagine burying a child 6 feet underground, suffocating but not able to fully die. Energy is not created or destroyed. It gets frozen. Imagine doing that and just telling the child to go away. They're an inconvenience. Other people hate them, so we don't want to be seen with them. And after 40 fucking years, that child tentatively raises a withered arm and is met with incompetence, met with hatred, met with ignorance, and with fear. With the clear message, we will exclude you if you honor this part in yourself, which is almost impossible to do. The pain is so high. When I asked the facilitators to love and listen to the story that I've shared in thousands of hours of video, what was a very small story then? I'm small, I'm overwhelmed, I'm terrified. I haven't encountered this part of me before. It's swamping my senses, my ability to feel. I'm flooded and I can't cope. I need someone to lift some of this shame off of this child so that I can breathe, so that I can think. I need someone to reassure me that they understand and they will be with me until I can function. The facilitators met with their attorney. They met with my abuser. They met with each other and came up with one of the most insane conclusions any group of therapists could possibly come up with. That this had nothing to do with them, that this wasn't a high issue, and that, if anything, I should pay the trainer of my abuser, pay Ann Watts, to mediate and teach Peter how to do the work he didn't know how to do at $175 an hour. Just like he didn't know how to keep his agreements, just like he didn't know how to obey even the most basic therapeutic protocols. Do you know how much worthlessness is within that request? We'd like you to pay us to abuse you. We'd like to abandon you, and we'd like you to pay the trainer of your abuser to push you towards secrecy and shame to ensure you do not get what you need most, love and support in the community, because we want to keep this secret. There's no louder scream of the betrayal, of the rage, of the hatred and the fear towards that infant. An infant that has been thrust into my awareness through the dissolution of all the defenses that our cult helps us create to mask the torture cell of the little ones that are bruised, butchered, and tormented within each one of us to fit into this cult. Those anesthetics were dissolved, but the torment and the torture escalated by my therapists, by my group of community leaders, by my teachers of love and into me you see. We're going to shut you out. We don't want to feel this pain inside of us, and so we're going to cut off the part of you willing to speak that we invoked in an unethical overdose to begin with, under the pretense of a solid container that was never there to begin with, without even a license to fall back on. This is the crime. This is the tragedy. This is the core pattern that induces profound trauma, profound loneliness, profound perfectionism as a coping mechanism, profound criticism as the frantic addiction to be perfect that goes both inner and outward, that leads to a variety of frantic survival strategies that are destructive to all concerned and which cannot answer the most critical need and focus of the entire dynamic: giving love to the innocence, to the truth, to the goodness of the feminine self, represented in the helpless little boy trying desperately to become and do anything necessary to exist, to be attuned to have needs met, and to be cared about by anyone at all, in a dissociative, sociopathic family where the primary law was thou shalt not feel. Surrounded in a cult that said not only shall you not feel, but you won't talk about the obvious emotional and relational illiteracy in the cult and its many sociopathic traits towards those who need the most support. All dysfunction, all trauma, all grief, all addiction, all insanity, all self-hatred, all invisibility, shame, isolation, and loneliness stem from this core template. The need for the unconditional love of the youngest, most innocent and vulnerable parts in the feminine psyche in both male and females, intersecting with the incompetency of dissociated, shame-based parents, teachers, and culture, desperately medicated through money, sex, addiction, eating, rampant self-criticism, perfectionism, and any number of other coping mechanisms that lead to exhaustion, depression, loneliness, and a sense of shame as we as individuals carry the inadequacy of our cult to respond to the most basic levels of our human need. Just a general sense of love and belonging, not because you're wearing Nikes, not because your hair is blonde or you're the right body weight, but because you're a human being. And I didn't get that. From Peter, from the facilitators, from the community, from myself, from my parents, from my cult, from my teachers, I didn't get that. And the grief, the terror, the loneliness, the shame, the panicky addiction that has been with me as an undertone my entire life is not answered by a protocol of denial, lies, dehumanization, lack of attunement, abject stupidity and cruelty by people who have read the books and made the commitments hundreds of times to a world where everyone wins. This is a world of hell. A hell I've been in my entire life, and a hell that escalated in its pain volume by 600% when it became clear that while Peter could strip off the scar tissue with a forced high psychedelic dose, he couldn't stick around to do his job and love, even at $175 an hour. Even when I waited for 6 months, even when I did it his way, even when I made him feel good, even when I gave him the desperate love of a needy child who had never had any man promise what Peter Sandhill promised, to take a rock-solid stand for my well-being. No man has ever promised that before. And Peter broke his promise within an hour of making it. He broke it before he arrived. He broke it when he lied to his wife. He broke it when he broke his facilitator agreements. He broke it when he glossed over my feelings and interjected his needs in a suggestive state. And he broke it by being the only therapist late for the most important session of my life, as my ego is panicking with the weight of this information, minute after timeless minute, as Peter performs the incredible maneuver of being the only therapist in 40 to not only be late for the first integrative session, to not only not communicate that he would be late, but complete blackout and failure to answer any of his devices as my panic escalated, am I going to be alone here, in a pain, in a dread, in an overwhelm that I'm not ready for, that I resisted going into, and that Peter promised he would be there for if I agreed to take 3 times the dose that I argued with him for 5 minutes was too much for my body. If Peter Sandhill was to take a machete and start hacking to bits men, women, and children indiscriminately, I wonder if the amount of pain unleashed is more than a fragmenting psyche overwhelmed with grief with no love in sight. The chauvinism of our cult discounts the horrors of the inner world, but it is shameful that therapists and healers need to be taught this by a client, carrying the burden of their incompetence for years, so that their self-image in public can go untainted with the knowledge of their incompetency and the cruelty of their ethic. I have never experienced anything so evil as a felt experience, which admittedly is not saying much, because I've been numb most of my life, deluged by the violence and the trauma of our media and TV. I've been numb most of my life. I was forced into a rape awakening by someone who didn't love themselves, their wife, their partner, their own little child enough to show up for mine, and didn't love anyone enough to tell the truth about that inadequacy, and instead begs to this day to be praised, to have it watered down. But what about this? But what about this? Aren't I good over here? That begs to this day to have their needs met at the expense of the community and the client. Now, this is the pattern that leads to 75% or so of our global torment. This pattern, fractally, holographically represented in 1,000 different ways, in 1 billion different faces. The running away from truth, the running away from responsibility, the betrayal of that part of us which needs the most love and integration and healing, the commitment to emotional, psychological, and traumatic illiteracy, the commitment to silence and secrecy, so that one generation leads to the next, so that no one has to deal with it. This is the wound of our cult. And while a nervous majority anxiously scapegoats and projects their unconscious wound onto their sensitives, while bullying, isolating, and shaming them, this is not my wound. This is the wound of my father, who was tormented into PTSD by 6 years old to accommodate our government's wish to unload World War II veterans with PTSD on children who were guaranteed to be violated and not fund the recovery. This is the wound of a cult who will celebrate the ending of a war, but take no interest in the state of the veterans coming home. This is the wound of a cult that projects evil out there on minor countries around the world, viciously causing terror and PTSD to deflect from the feelings back home. This is the wound of parents who, feeling helpless and small in a cult that is committed to their emotional ignorance and incompetence, dumps that helplessness onto their children and turns away rather than apologize for the crime. I may be screaming the loudest from this pain, compounding a ripping away of defenses, escalated re-traumatization, PTSD, and abuse by 4 of my therapists in the high community. But this is not my wound. This is our issue. And the pattern will not change. It will not change by excluding those people who say the truth of the wound. It will not change by scapegoating the abuser of the day. It will change as you and I develop the courage to understand the wound and its place inside our bodies and our psyches, as you and I take the initiative to boost our literacy in at least a few areas. Maybe read a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Maybe read a few books on shame. Maybe ask our schools committed to the world where everyone wins to actually engage with maybe 30% of the toxicity that guarantees that no one wins. You see, when that child is betrayed in a professional capacity, it guarantees that no one wins. The child doesn't win. The adaptive coping personality is not what the world needs, but is inevitable when the authentic self is abandoned, betrayed, and shamed in a cult that doesn't know how to love. High couldn't be farther away from winning. By meticulously enacting the exact antithesis of its mission and then burying the secret in shame to ensnare the next abuser without warning, to ensnare the next victim without warning. Peter is as much a victim as I am, but he is in a completely different role as someone with authority, someone who has abused that authority multiple times, someone who has not even had the decency to offer a refund, let alone seek competent therapeutic help from a trained trauma therapist to protect my life and his career. There is a profound expression of self-hatred in Peter Sandhill, but he is lied to by his peers who say, oh, you're great. You can do this work, no problem. Don't bother about a license. Don't bother about telling the public the truth of your incompetence. It'll make us look bad. That is a betrayal. And when we stand by as team members and community and say, sure, we'll call that the room of love, we are participating in a cruel and vicious lie that guarantees the traumatization of the most vulnerable people in our cult. It is not love. At best, it is addictive coping mechanism. At best, it is a reenactment of the childhood abuse dynamic. And at worst, it is downright evil. You do not take the trust and innocence of people who know they are sick and ask for help and leverage that trust under the suggestibility of psychedelics or therapy or touch into pushing a client into the exact wrong direction for their balance, health, integrity, sanity, and well-being. That is criminal, cruel, sociopathic abuse with magnified impact because the client can't protect against that abuse when it is relabeled as love. And High is doing everyone a disservice by never defining what love is, by never defining what addiction is, by never defining what shame is, by never defining what violation and rape is. It is committed to ignorance, which is a commitment to abuse. This is the core pattern that will ripple out until it is respected and acknowledged and responded to by the only part in the psyche capable of responding. The nurturing parent of the transcendent adult. You don't get to become an adult without facing death. I have felt like I was going to die since the moment this came up. That's years ago. I still encounter frozen, helpless parts that feel they're going to die. You don't get to be an adult with any capacity to respond to this terrain until you're willing to face death. And we raise children in our cult by patronizing, cutting down, humiliating, and making the most absurd renditions of vicarious life on our sitcoms, etc., to do anything but ignore the most vital parts of our emotional selves that are expressing themselves in our children's bodies, in our obesity, in our addiction, in our anxiety, in our depression, in our exhaustion, in our insanity, day by day by day, without a single competent adult, inside or out, from cradle to grave, who says, "Not on my watch." This is wrong, it's pathetic, and it is so easy to develop the technologies that do a much better job of dealing with this. How about trauma circles? How about holding and listening someone when they're in a traumatic state verging on PTSD? Is that really beyond our ability? Or is that just going to interrupt the next binge watching on Netflix? The next self-rumination ritual to mask the fact that what's going on in that human being is going on inside. And we're not really that worried about the other person at all. We're just committed to avoiding that pain inside. Well, there's good news. There's a lot of things that work a lot better, and thankfully I have one adult. I'm a 1/3 adult now. Hooray, hooray, I've grown up 30%. Amazing. Despite my culture, I'm partially an adult. I now have one, I would say she's, 60, 70% adult. Beaten, raped, humiliated, etc. She still regresses as a healer transcending this work, but she's more adult than me, and that's a relief. Finally, someone. My wife's 20% an adult. That's a relief. At least I can lean on someone 20% of the time. So life is pretty good. My dog is a lot more intelligent than most people in my life, so provides another 25% boost of well-being. But the adult in you, latent or growing or seeking some way out, some way to make this life meaningful, wants to respond to this stuff, wants to stop lying. You didn't come to high or do therapy or read books, etc., just so you could go to sleep and end life in self-loathing, addiction, loneliness, shame, and grief that you don't know how to feel in a cult that shames you for feeling. You didn't do that. You want to grow, you want to learn. And I invite you to join me in becoming more literate, becoming more aware, and raising your voice. It can't hurt. The number one enemy is silence for the most vulnerable parts of the feminine psyche, the most vulnerable parts of the little one that is in each one of us, that can always use more love and always gives back more than is given.